Okay, this is Steve Zeltzer with Workweek, and today I'm with William Robinson. He's a distinguished professor of sociology and global and international studies, Latin American and Iberian studies, and affiliated faculty Chicana and Chicano studies with the University of California in Santa Barbara. Welcome, William.
Pleasure to be on.
And today we're going to be looking at an important book that Professor William Robinson has written called Global Civil War, Capitalism Post-Pandemic. And we're doing this interview in the midst of an ongoing war now in Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine, and the encirclement of Russia by US and NATO, which is leading to potentially a world war. And combined in that is the censorship, the tech war that's going on. And his book, and your book, William, is really about these developments and how they're interrelated to capitalism, global capitalism, exploitation, profit, and monopolization of capital globally. So first, let's talk about the role of the pandemic in how it's affected capitalism on a global level and how capitalists are using the pandemic not only to profit of it, and billionaires have made tremendous amounts of profit in the middle of the pandemic, but also as a use of control and collecting data and spying on people throughout the world.
Yeah, so I mean, that's an enormous question with a lot to discuss there. Well, we have to start by saying that global capitalism was already in crisis before the pandemic, possibly the worst crisis in its history, a major structural crisis, but also a political crisis of state legitimacy and capitalist hegemony, of obviously an ecological crisis, which makes it essential, and a social crisis in the sense that billions of people can no longer survive under global capitalism, and that the fact that billions of people are locked out and can no longer survive is not necessarily a crisis for global capitalism and the transnational elite unless those billions of people are rising up. And that's one of the key themes of the book. That's why it's titled Global Civil War. They are rising up. There's been a global revolt which has been picking up steam since 2018, and it actually intensified during the pandemic. So we have this multi-pronged crisis of global capitalism. The pandemic did not cause this crisis, but it did make it much worse. So the way that the digitalization, because there are several key themes to the book. One is this crisis of global capitalism. The second is the pandemic, how that unfolded and how it aggravated this crisis. The third is digitalization, and I hope we can get in, talk about in some detail on that in the interview. And then the fourth key theme, these four themes of there's four chapters and four themes, is global civil war. It's the global revolt from below, leading us to a global global civil war. So let me say that the world capitalist system is on the brink of a new round of major restructuring and transformation based on this much more advanced digitalization of the entire global economy and society, based on what people have been calling the fourth industrial revolution technology. I can go into a little bit of detail of what I mean by that. We're in a new stage of capitalism, which is globalized capitalism. And that goes back to the 1980s, to the introduction, well, it goes back to many things going on in the late 20th century, but the introduction of computer and information technology and the internet in the 1980s allowed for the first round of capitalist globalization. It allowed what I call the transnational capitalist class to synchronize global production through this new internet and computer technology, and therefore to put into place a new globally integrated system of production, finance, and services into which every country in the world has been integrated in the last few decades. Many countries integrated violently. And certainly through structural violence of IMF structural adjustment and the World Bank and so forth. But now, starting in the second decade of the 21st century, we see a second generation of digital-based technologies leading to a new dramatic round of worldwide restructuring. And this new generation of technologies and the restructuring and transformation that it's bringing about promises to have profound transformative impact on the global economy, society, the global polity, and so forth. And the listeners and the viewers will be very familiar with these technologies. We're talking about artificial intelligence and machine learning, with big data, the collection, processing, and analysis of immense amount of data, the Internet of Things, blockchain, automation, and robotization. And I know we'll get into this in the interview, the impacts of all of these technologies, nano and biotechnology, involving, of course, also with biotechnology, big pharma and the medical industrial complex, and they played a major role in the pandemic. 3D printing, quantum and cloud computing, which is a new level of computing which allows all of these technologies to operate around the globe, autonomously driven air, land, and sea vehicles, augmented reality and virtual reality, and of course the 5G network, which is a network necessary for all of these technologies. So just to summarize this point, we have these radical new technologies, which are once again bringing about a fundamental transformation of world capitalism, but in a way which, under the control of the transnational capitalist class and capitalist states, is aggravating all of the tensions involved in the crisis. It's aggravating the underlying structural or economic crisis. It is aggravating and greatly increasing global inequalities and political and civic tension everywhere. Basically, they're resulting in a deepening and expansion of this global civil war, which really we are already in.
And we're speaking with Professor William Robinson. Now, the deindustrialization of the United States in the 60s and 70s, latter 60s and 70s, was to increase profits of corporations in the United States. So they went first to the South and Mexico and Asia. And maybe you can talk about how this outsourcing of the industry in the United States and the development of a global internet economy where they could have production around the world. So workers in the United States would be competing with workers in China, in Turkey, all over the world, was about how they did that, and also the question of profit, increasing their profits on a global level.
Absolutely. That's an absolutely critical question. And let's look at how that played out in the last few decades, deindustrialization in the United States. But let's also look about how these new technologies and the pandemic has pushed this even into a new phase, a new, radically new phase. So I was mentioning that the computer and information technology and the internet from the 1980s and on was the technological basis that allowed these processes to take place. They allowed, and we want to remember, because you said this correctly, these technologies don't exist in isolation. They are developed so that capital can constantly increase and maximize profit, and at the same time can constantly increase its control over the global working and popular classes. So these technologies were introduced in the late 20th century, and they allowed the transnational capitalist class to go global, to break free of each nation state, to transfer global production and economic activity to cheap labor zones or to countries where there's dictatorships or where there's less regulatory environment. And that's how we get to the deindustrialization of the United States. It was technologically possible because of these technologies, but it was driven by the search by capital to maximize profit by moving elsewhere in the globe, and to break the power of the working classes in the United States and the other rich countries. So that's the story that we're already familiar with. But what happens now is that we are seeing a new radical restructuring of global capitalism based on these new technologies. And let us talk about labor for a moment, because capitalism, it's fundamentally capitalism is a system in which the capitalist class, in this case, the transnational capitalist class, wants to maximize profit by doing two things. And first of all, by replacing human beings with technology. And so we've been seeing that. That's the history of the last 30, 40 years or so. But now these new technologies for a radical deepening of placing human labor by technology. And this was turbocharged during the pandemic. The pandemic has turbocharged the process by which digitalization, more and more areas of global economy and society are converted into digital realms. So we've seen during the pandemic a vast expansion of laborless digital services, of telework arrangements, of drone delivery, of automated medical and legal services, remote teaching, of course, a dramatic expansion of automation and robotization in the production process. So previously, we knew that some automation has been taking place. But what we're seeing now is that both manual labor, which we generally associate with not being not possible to automate, is rapidly being automated. I want to give some examples here. Agriculture is being robotized and automated. And this was accelerated by the pandemic. Prior to the pandemic, already here in California, where we are, automatic machine harvesters of strawberries were being introduced and of grapes in wine country. But so what happens during, and this is all over the world, not just here, in bread baskets around the world. So what happened during the pandemic, for instance, is that migrants could not cross borders. The migrants are the cheap labor force for harvesting. So Italy has this massive wine industry and an agricultural, agribusiness sector. And the workers for that came from North Africa and elsewhere. And they couldn't come during the pandemic because of lockdowns and borders were closed. And so the agribusiness companies in Italy rapidly transitioned to automated agriculture. The same thing has been happening and accelerated in the pandemic in agriculture in California. But I'm mentioning this as one example. Fast food is being automated. Construction is being automated with 3D printing and so forth. Mining. You imagine that millions of workers go into the ground around the world to mine. Well, that's still taking place, but very rapidly, mining involves automation and machinery rather than human being. Warehousing, robotized factories. So with this new generation, it's not just deindustrialization of the rich countries, but it's the new, all of this manual labor in the coming years is going to be increasingly automated. But that's only part of the story. We now have professional work, which we would assume is not being automated. That's done by high-skilled, high-paid, stable labor. But increasingly, lawyers, financial analysts, doctors, journalists, accountants, insurance underwriters, librarians, all of this work is moving towards automation, because these new technologies allow for algorithms to take over even what is professional work, including machine learning that involves pattern recognition and complex communication. So we are moving towards a situation where more and more of humanity is either done through, is either precarious labor, facing automation and facing de-skilling and downward mobility, or simply locked out of the global economy. I'll conclude this point with saying one thing, that we're moving, and this is theoretically, we'll never get fully there, but we're moving towards a situation of laborless production. In fact, Marx spoke about that, a situation when automation and technology become so advanced that the human being is eliminated from the process of production. We're moving towards that. We'll never get fully there, but this is a new ball game in which we're in. And then the second thing we're moving towards is zero marginal cost. Now, this is a little bit technical, but what zero marginal cost means is that once you make an initial investment to produce something, whatever it is, and after you've made that initial investment, it's virtually free to produce more and more and more. A very simplistic example is software. You make an initial investment to develop software, but after that, you can produce 10 billion copies of that software at zero cost. So laborless production and zero marginal cost might sound like future science fiction, but what it means is that it aggravates, deeply, deeply aggravates the contradictions of capitalism, the underlying structural or economic crisis of capitalism, which of course we haven't spoken about yet. But these are some of the things going on and some of the things I take up in the book. If there's time, Steve, before you get to the next question, I just want to point out also that this has very serious implications for class and social struggle, because Marx wrote about a situation where, as bad as capitalism was, it aggregated thousands of workers under a single factory and brought them together. And under those conditions, historically, from the Industrial Revolution right up until the post-World War II period, that meant that workers saw each other and developed a collective class consciousness, a collective social consciousness, and struggled together, hundreds and even thousands coming together. Now, what this new digitalization is doing is it's disaggregating the labor process. The data, one of the studies showed that 20% of workers that went worldwide into telework from home is now going to be locked into that. So you have millions of workers, but they don't see each other. They're not in contact with each other. So this undermines, the traditional way in which workers develop class and collective consciousness and take collective action. It intensifies alienation. I mean, I can go on, but these are some of the radical changes taking place.
And of course, the policies of privatization, deregulation of the economy have been not only instituted in the United States, but pushed internationally by the IMF, the World Bank, the United States, in Chile with a coup that the United States and the AFL-CIO were involved in. But these policies, these economic policies of capitalism to make capitalists more profitable, have not been fought politically, and there's no movement in the working class organized politically against these policies. So that is part of the problem in the working class. The ideological struggle against the policies of capitalism have not been challenged politically.
Absolutely. Well, let's look at this. Yes, the capital went on an offensive. Well, let's take the story back a little bit. The 1960s and 70s was the last period of major worldwide uprisings. Of course, in the United States, we had everything we know about the anti-war movement, the Black and Chicano liberation movements, the rise of a radical women's and feminist movement, the countercultural movement. There was all of that, but really the 1960s and 70s was a mass uprising all around the world, including third world national liberation movements and revolutionary movements and popular struggles all over the world. So that was defeated. That round was defeated by capitalist globalization, which, just as you pointed out, involved neoliberal structural adjustment, it involved free trade agreements, it involved capital achieving this newfound global mobility so it could move about the world and enhance its own power over the global working and popular classes. That's completely correct, what you are pointing out. And so the left worldwide suffered a defeat and setbacks and never really got fully back the left, including leftist parties, back on its feet ever since then. But what we do have is a pushback which begins not by the left and leftist parties, but a pushback by social movements from below, which reaches their heights in the late 1990s with the global justice movement, but then goes on the defensive again with 9/11 and with the Middle Eastern wars. But let's remember that we have a global financial collapse in 2008. And that economic crisis is still going on. It was never recovered, and it's going on. And then with the pandemic, it simply intensified. So we have an upsurge. This is why the book is titled Global Civil War. We have a massive upsurge of a global revolt taking place. And let me just give you some data on this global revolt, because it's extremely significant. In the United States, a poll was carried out. Remember 2019, fall of 2019 was a crescendo in this global revolt. We saw uprisings, and was this a people spring in fall 2019? We saw uprisings in Chile to Lebanon, from Iraq to India, from France, the Yellow Vest movement, to the United States, from Haiti to Nigeria, from South Africa to Colombia, all of these mass struggles. And during this time, I want to quote from two polls here. One poll showed that 60% of millennials in the United States and 50% of Generation Z supported, in this poll, a complete change of our economic system away from capitalism. That was the question. 57 and 60%. Worldwide, a 2020 poll in the midst of the pandemic found that a majority of people around the world, and all of this is in the book, by the way, 56% believe that capitalism is doing more harm than good. So we have a situation of a crisis of state legitimacy, a crisis of capitalist hegemony. And one other thing, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, which monitors global protests, reported that between 2018 and 2020, there were significant anti-government protests in 110 countries. By significant, they mean large-scale uprisings involving 230 major actions that overthrew no less than 30 governments. At the beginning of the pandemic, the reason I'm mentioning all of this is because we have this terrible disjuncture between this upsurge in mass struggles and social movements from below all over the world, but no significant organized left and transformative project that can give it some coherence and direction. But and in the book, my third chapter is titled Whither the Global Revolt. And in the beginning of the pandemic in the United States, we had 1,000 major strikes. 1,000 strikes in the first 6 months of the pandemic. We had the uprising against the police murder of George Floyd, which brought 25 to 30 million people in the streets. At the beginning of the pandemic, we had a strike of 150 million people in India. And then a year later, 250 million people, the single biggest labor mobilization in the history of the planet. But here's the thing, that third chapter in my book points out to 4 quandaries or challenges for these popular struggles. And I'll just mention the first because it's what you're pointing out. There's this disjuncture between a proliferation of these mass movements all over the world and a left, an organized left, a socialist-oriented left, and leftist political parties that could serve as some rudder and help steer all of these struggles to some larger transformative project. We don't have that. And in the book, I use the Black Lives Matter led uprising in the wake of the murder of George Floyd as a case study in these 4 challenges to the left. The BL uprising went nowhere. I participated here in Los Angeles. I saw thousands, tens of thousands of young people just thirsty for radical change, thirsty to challenge this system, but with the left nowhere to be found, with no critique of the capitalist state, with no speaking about or trying to work towards a project of general transformation. And so this is one of the dilemmas of this popular uprising around the world.
Well, the issue of COVID and the inability of capitalism to deal with COVID, other than to say people have to accept it, the herd immunity. There's no real public health care program. The healthcare system, public health system has been bled to death, destroyed, and workers are being told you have to go back to work even without protection. There was no PPE. We're 2 years after the pandemic, and there's still no mass protocol for testing. It seems like that is an example of the inability of capitalism really to confront this worldwide pandemic.
Well, the capitalist states were exposed through the pandemic as callous instruments of power and wealth and corruption, which only intensified the crisis of capitalist legitimacy and hegemony. But, you know, I want to point out something else. One, the capitalist states and big pharma could not resolve our health emergency. But the other thing that took place is the global health emergency facilitated this massive transformation of wealth to the rich and to the transnational capitalist class. It heightened their power. It allowed the ruling groups to impose this state of exception to incredibly enhance surveillance and control through what I call the global police state. And it allowed these ruling groups, led by the tech companies, to accelerate this restructuring, digitally driven restructuring of global capitalism that I had been mentioning about, but let's look at the pandemic and inequality. Even before we went into the pandemic, 1% of humanity, led by 26 million millionaires and 2,400 billionaires, controlled over 50%, 52% of the world's wealth. 20% of the population going into the pandemic controlled 95% of the world's wealth. That means already going into the pandemic, 80% of the world's population had only 5% of the world's wealth. So what happens during the pandemic? The ultra wealthy to take the example of the United States, increases its wealth by $931 billion just in the first few months of 2020. While 60 million workers lost their job, thrust into poverty, expansion of hunger, and of homelessness. Worldwide, the billionaires' wealth increased by 27% to $10.2 trillion in the first 2 months of the pandemic. What we saw all over the world, especially in the United States, is the pocket of the rich were lined through price gouging, through fraud, through racketeering. Let me give an example in the United States. In the United States, the private corporate hospitals jacked up charges to patients by as much as 18 times above cost. They were able to do that because our taxpayers, given over to the state, was then the state paid for this. So industry profits, private corporate hospital profits approached an annual rate of $100 billion. Pfizer, to take that example, its 2021 profit rates were $81 billion. That compares to before the pandemic between $25 and $30 billion. Moderna, its profits grew, and this is the actual figure, by 7,170% in 2021. So what we see is the pandemic accelerated the wealth and power of the rich. And in a moment, I want to talk about the particular capitalist groups that came to dominate through the pandemic. And the whole burden of this health crisis was shifted onto the working and popular classes around the world. Let's remember that just the United States and the European Union provided $8 trillion in 2020 in bailouts to corporations, while 2.7 billion people on the planet had no government support whatsoever.
And this issue of capitalism and the capitalist parties in the United States, the Democrats, Bernie Sanders are trying to reform the capitalist parties, but even in the midst of this pandemic, even in California, no national health care, no single payer. Basically, the drug companies, the tech companies are making out massively from the pandemic, yet there's no wealth tax. There's not even reform of these capitalist companies by the capitalist parties in the United States.
Yes, absolutely. The response of, again, the transnational capitalist class, but also the political and economic elites in capitalist states, their response to the pandemic was that this is an enormous opportunity to intensify wealth and power. And from above, the response was to assure that any and every response to the health emergency would be one based on private capital accumulation, private profit making, and also a response that would heighten surveillance and social control at a time when the global revolt that I had already been speaking about was really taking off. So if I may, there's the one hand, the incredible intensification of the power and wealth of the leading capitalist groups backed by the capitalist state. And I talk in this book about a new hegemonic block of capital that brings together three groups. One are the tech companies. And I have some data here, but unbelievable how the tech companies increased their presence, their control over the global economy, and their profits and their capitalization during the pandemic. But the second wing of this new hegemonic block of capital is the military-industrial complex. And they had already been integrated into tech. Tech and the military-industrial complex go together. And they tremendously increased their presence during the pandemic and their fusion with tech capital. And the third wing is the giant pharmaceutical companies. They now dominate the medical agenda. I won't say the health agenda because their interest is not health. Their interest is profit. But they dramatically increased their presence in global economy and society and their control. And the fourth part of this new hegemonic block of capital is the banks. The banks are totally fused into tech, into pharma, into the military-industrial complex. So this emerging block of hegemonic capital becomes tremendously more powerful. But that's part of it. The pandemic means massive profit making. But the second thing, and this is so important because a lot of the left has missed this, the pandemic and the response to it and the control of these new capitalist groups and of the state has dramatically increased the mechanisms of social control and of repression. What did we see during the pandemic? We saw that governments centralized the response, declared states of emergency, imposed what some people have called medical martial law. Now, this is a virus which is deadly. So the issue here is not that we had to respond to the virus, but how capital and the state responded. Imposing states of emergency, intensifying social control, deploying police and military forces around the world, heightening vast new digital surveillance systems. In country after country, this is all in the book, governments used emergency powers to ban protests, to harass dissidents, to censor journalists, to scapegoat minority groups. 158 countries around the world, that's over 3/4 of the countries in the world, imposed these drastic restrictions. Let me give 4 or 5 examples of what takes place here. The Indian government faced this strike, first of 150 million people, then 250 million people in the midst of the pandemic. So they had the world's strictest lockdown. And we saw police carrying out street beatings and humiliation all over the country. Tens of millions of migrant workers were forced to walk home hundreds of kilometers with extreme humiliation, reports of death in custody, mass arrests, spraying people with bleach, so-called to disinfect them. In Honduras, which now we just have the democratically elected, the government, the leftist government of Xiomara Castro. But Honduras was in the midst of a dictatorship, and that dictatorship stepped up arbitrary detention of known dissidents during the pandemic under the smokescreen of fighting the pandemic. In the Philippines, Rodrigo Duarte issued shoot-to-kill orders for anyone defying stay-at-home orders. The Kenyan government, a dictatorial government, unleashed this wave of repression. In one example in Mombasa, and we saw this in the YouTube videos, security forces tear gassed and beat crowds of people. They were told to go home because they have to go into lockdown. And as they scrambled to get home, they were tear gassed and beaten. Trump in the United States, I'll conclude with this anecdote. Trump evoked the Defense Production Act, which is an act which says in the midst of a military emergency, the government can take charge of production. And he did so because some of the meatpacking plants were closed because it was such a viral spread, and very dangerous conditions. And these meatpacking plants in the United States, the vast majority of the workforce are migrants, many of them undocumented migrants. So Trump evoked the Defense Production Act to force the meatpacking workers to go back to the plants in dangerous conditions. And in one plant, Tyson plant in Iowa, the managers when they went back to work, placed bets on how many workers would die. They placed bets, who would win the bet. This is all, documented. 6 died within 1 month of going back from work from the from COVID. So just in summary, we see that the pandemic allowed for this massive intensification of control and profit making, but also it allowed the ruling groups to push back against the global revolt that had been exploding in the lead up to the pandemic and continued to explode during the pandemic itself.
And one of the issues also in this period is increasing inter-imperialist rivalries. And China had a zero COVID policy. It's interesting that Tesla has a plant in Shanghai. They were able to shut down the virus, but the Tesla plant in Fremont had the virus. Workers were died from it, and their families were infected. And the United States was demanding that China end its zero COVID policy. Maybe you can talk about this inter-imperialist rivalry and also the demand by the United States that China end its policy of zero COVID.
Well, the problem that the United States had with the policy of zero COVID, and not just the United States, the transnational capitalist class, is that the Chinese economy was essentially shut down in such a way that that was going to affect global corporate profits and access to the market, the vast China market, and to all of these production facilities, which are really co-investments by Chinese state and private corporations with transnational corporations from around the world. So the zero COVID policy was less, the problem that global elites had with it was less the health dimensions as much as it is that it closed down access to the China market and to making profits in China. But there is a larger story here to this new Cold War, to what you're calling inter-imperialist rivalry. And it is that every country in the world, this is, again, you know, my book starts by talking about the global crisis, because the crisis of global capitalism frames the issue of the pandemic, and it frames the issue of global civil war. And so every country in the world is facing this legitimacy crisis. The masses of people around the world don't see their governments as legitimate anymore. And as I mentioned with that earlier data, the capitalist system faces a crisis of hegemony. People are rejecting capitalism more and more. So by whipping up international tensions and seeking wars and conflicts, the United States in particular attempts to externalize internal political tensions, the internal crisis of legitimacy. That is part of what's going on with this increase in geopolitical tensions and US aggression around the world. The US wants conflicts to externalize this internal tension and the failure of capitalism in the United States to resolve the plight of the majority. But there's a second thing going on, Steve, and that is what in my previous book that you interviewed me on a couple of years ago, Global Police State, I analyzed and called militarized accumulation. And what I meant by militarized accumulation is increasingly military spending, spending on repression, spending on building walls and private immigrant detention centers and conflicts and so forth, are an increasing source of profits for the transnational capitalist class at a time when the global economy is in stagnation. And historically, wars and conflicts stimulate the economy at a time when you don't have civilian stimulation of the economy. So the whole global economy is more and more dependent on military spending. Remember that late last year, late 2021, the US government approved a military Pentagon budget of nearly $800 billion. And at a time when the Afghan war was over, when the Iraq war had largely winded down, and when there were no major military conflicts worldwide. So the US needs a new war, new military conflicts to legitimate that kind of military spending. And it's not just the 800 billion, there's the Homeland Security spending, there's the CIA, and I think there's 17 different, intelligence and covert operations agencies. So it's well over $1 trillion. How do you justify that? You justify that by having a new Cold War. You justify this incredible defending on military and accumulation, militarized accumulation, by provoking these conflicts. So this Ukraine conflict is a tragedy for the world. It's a tragedy for the people of Ukraine, for the people of Russia, for people all over the world. But it is exactly what the United States needed and wanted. And beyond that, it's exactly what the powers that be dependent on militarized accumulation wanted. So, there's a bigger story than just the geopolitical dimensions to what's going on in Ukraine and to the new Cold War.
And the militarization of the United States, the rise of fascism that is developing here and around the world, isn't this historically a response to the crisis of capitalism, the inability of capitalism to deal with its basic contradictions?
Exactly. And the final section of one of these chapters is looking at the threat of fascism, of authoritarianism, and of fascism. And so I had been talking about the popular global revolt from below. And that is true that has taken off and it's intensifying. But the response from below to this crisis of capitalism is also a far-right response. The far right, including the fascist right, is taking advantage of the increasing destabilization of the world's people in the face of capitalist globalization, downward mobility, rising social insecurity and tension, mass unemployment and underemployment and economic difficulties. The far right is mobilizing this discontent into far right projects, and in some cases, openly fascist projects. And yes, you are right that fascism is always a particular response to capitalist crisis. It was in the 1930s, and it is now in the 21st century. It's a particular response, which of course involves an intensification of social control and repression and authoritarianism, but it's also a response that always involves scapegoating. In the 1930s, it was, Jews in Germany. Now, at first it was under Trump, it was immigrants. Now the scapegoating is Russia and China is threatening the United States. But the other thing about fascism is that consensual mechanisms of social control in the United States and many countries around the world are breaking down. They're breaking down because inequality and mass deprivation is just too intense for consensual mechanisms of social control to do the trick. And so increasingly, states are turning to repressive and authoritarian responses to keeping the population in check, keeping a lid on mass discontent. And the other thing you see in the United States is this mobilization in civil society, and you see this in other countries in the world, a mobilization in civil society of paramilitary groups and far-right groups. So yes, we face the threat of what I've called 21st century fascism, and that threat has gone nowhere with the pandemic. In fact, it's still here, very much alive, and that's a key danger. This takes us back to the story of those quandaries, those challenges to this global revolt. And I mentioned one of the challenges, we have a left which is in crisis worldwide. We have leftist parties that don't really have a significant presence in most countries in the world. And as long as you have no left leadership of this global revolt, the far right will use the global revolt to organize for its project. And that's what we see in the United States, for instance.
And the use of the internet by the capitalists, control of the media monopolies and tech companies to censor the internet. There's been even professors, Rabab Abdelhadi at San Francisco State, Zoom, Facebook, and YouTube canceled her program, her educational program, class. It seems like these media tech companies now are deciding what is going to be on and not on.
This is an extreme danger. And I regret to say here that during the pandemic, we see an incredible intensification of censorship, not just censorship, control over information that we get about the world. And it was done in the name of misinformation around the pandemic. And I would love to speak to that because we need to be clear. The argument here is not that the virus was mild or anything. The virus is real and it can be deadly for people in a fragile state of health and with comorbidities. So this was a real global health emergency. But having said that, we have to acknowledge that the ruling groups developed a narrative on this pandemic, a narrative which, as I already mentioned, allowed for maximum profit maximization and capital accumulation, and it allowed for an intensification of social control and the surveillance state at every level. And part of that was all of this censorship in the name of there's misinformation about the pandemic and there's disinformation. And I've studied this very carefully for the book. This is, in the first chapter of the book. Some of this is, of course, wild conspiracy theories that, that this was deliberately unleashed on the population and so forth, even though there is certain evidence that this was made in a laboratory, but not to harm the world's people. We know that, and this was going on way before the pandemic, we know that the big pharmaceutical companies are developing in all of these labs gain of function properties on viruses. They're doing so not to hurt people. They're doing so because then they want to be able to develop a vaccine and create global vaccine markets for billions of dollars in profits. That was going on before the pandemic. It's not secret. It's not a conspiracy theory. That was done publicly. And so the response to the pandemic, as I mentioned previously, was everything that would maximize corporate profit and maximize the global police state surveillance capacity. And so anyone that has mentioned anything during the pandemic that may be scientifically based, that may be something we should explore and discuss, has been repressed. And the left went along with that in the face of the health emergency. But this escalation of censorship during the pandemic is now going to be used in a general sense against the left and to shore up the powers that be in global capitalism. The censorship is not going to end when the pandemic ends, which is just about ending. The censorship, we're now in a new stage in which the new normal is that these giant tech companies and the state can censor anything it considers misinformation. And that happened during the pandemic. I mentioned all of these emergency laws. A lot of these emergency laws in 151 countries around the world during the pandemic didn't just say that people would be fined or imprisoned if they gave misinformation on the virus. It said any misinformation that the government deems as misinformation can now be punished. And so, yes, we are moving into a new situation in global police state where there's a new normal of across-the-board censorship by the tech companies and the capitalist state. And it's very dangerous.
And one of the issues as far as workers and health and safety is biotech industry. And while the right wing and the government are concerned, they say they're concerned about these releases from biotech laboratories, accidental or on purpose, the protection of biotech workers is non-existent in the United States. OSHA does not protect workers. In California, there are less than 200 OSHA inspectors for 18 million workers. This is 2 years after the pandemic. Workers are unprotected by regulatory agencies, which are supposed to protect them. And in the biotech industry, workers have been contaminated, have gotten genetically engineered diseases as a result of lack of protection by these biotech companies, like Pfizer, for example. And the danger of a release from these laboratories is growing. And it's the capture of the state by these corporations. It means that there's no regulation and they are able to do what they want without any control. Is this a part of what's happening within capitalism and the capitalist state?
Well, absolutely. And the defunding of OSHA and the absolutely ridiculous low levels of state monitoring of dangers in dangers in the workplace to workers. That's been going on for 40 years now, the whittling away of OSHA. But the other thing going on is not just that, but also that the regulatory agencies, which are supposed to protect both workers and consumers from all of these dangers, have long since simply been captured by capital. So the Food and Drug Administration and the CDC has long been captured by big pharma. The US Department of Agriculture has long been captured by agribusiness. The Pentagon, of course, has long been captured and controlled by the military-industrial complex. So none of that is new. But what is new about the pandemic here is that there is a radical, and this is in the book, there is a dramatic increase in big pharma turning to produce any and every form of vaccine and new drug just to make profit when they're not necessarily medically necessary or when they're not tested and not even necessarily safe. And they're doing so in all of these biolabs around the world. I mean, big pharma's biggest ones are in the US, but also Europe, also, elsewhere. And exactly as you point out,
even in Ukraine, there are biotech laboratories.
Even in Ukraine, and not just biotech laboratories that are run by big pharma, but there's also just the United States has Pentagon has 25 bioweapons labs. That's a lot more than 25, but in 25 countries around the world. But before we get into bioweapons, just going back to all of these laboratories and their dangers, as big pharma has become more and more dominant and wants to more and more expand a global vaccine market, which, by the way, the global vaccine, all of this is in the book. The global vaccine market was valued before the pandemic at $40 billion. And before the pandemic, big pharma, and backed by Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and other foundations and agencies, were asking themselves, how can we expand the global vaccine market? And so the pandemic allows for this dramatic expansion. But part of the increase in big pharma profits means that you cut costs and you cut corners, which means that you don't carry out safety protocols in these laboratories. And so it's not just the workers that are in danger, but it's also the possibility of the leak out of new pathogens, which might be much more deadly than COVID-19 in the future. So, I mean, this is an extreme danger to humanity. The ability of giant corporations with government agencies in their pocket to develop new pathogens just in the interest of then saying, oh, we got a vaccine for it, and then having it leak out by accident, or maybe even in the future, on purpose. There's something I want to read because it's so dramatic. If you allow me, Stephen, if we still have time in the interview. So I want to emphasize that we put aside the right-wing conspiracy theories, right? That these injections, the vaccines that we're getting had little chips in them to monitor us. Put that all aside. And let's talk from the position of the left. The project, and I was shocked when I did the research for this. At the beginning of the pandemic, I started researching how all of it was about profit and control. But as I got deeper into the research, I found that it's even more than that. It's that the project, and again, I'm not saying conspiratorially that this COVID-19 was released for this. It was probably an accidental release, either from bats to human beings, or an accidental release. And there's evidence for both. But here's the point. From about 2010 until the pandemic of 2020, all of the big pharma groups, together with the research labs they control, and again, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation enter the picture here. They had been trying to find ways to expand the global vaccine market, not because of they, in an evil way, want to poison humanity, but because they want to make profit. And making profit means that you develop vaccines for any and everything, and you impose it on the world's people. So in 2010, some of your listeners will have already heard this. In 2010, Big Pharma joins with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and they called for mandatory vaccine laws. This was 2010. And Rockefeller Foundation, together with them, released a report, and the report's supposed to be, why do we need mandatory vaccine laws? All the way back in 2010. And they released a report called Lockstep Scenario. And this is public. I mean, nothing here is conspiratorial or secret. And let me read a quote from this report. Again, this is 2010, Rockefeller report on why we need mandatory vaccine laws. And the report spoke about a coronavirus pandemic, 2010. And it said, it's like the imaginary scenario, how would it unfold? And the report said, China's government was not, this is fictitious, but China's government was not the only one that took extreme measures to protect its citizens from risk and exposure. During the pandemic, national leaders around the world flexed their authority and imposed airtight rules and restrictions, from the mandatory wearing of face masks to body temperature checks at the entries of communal spaces like train stations and supermarkets. Even after the pandemic faded, this more authoritarian control and oversight of citizens and their activities stuck and even intensified in order to protect themselves from the spread of increasingly global problems, from pandemics and transnational terrorism to environmental crises and rising poverty. Leaders around the world took a firmer grip on power. So they're saying this in 2010 as an imaginary coronavirus pandemic. And that's actually played out. And then, and again, none of this is to fall into the right-wing conspiracy theory, because I don't think the pandemic was pre-planned at all. Not in the least, but it comes out of 10 years of trying to create mass vaccine markets around the world and to have mandatory vaccine laws that are controlled by Big Pharma and their agencies. So on the eve of the outbreak, again, this is all very public. This was in October of 2019, right before the outbreak. The World Economic Forum, which is, the forum of the cream of the global elite, corporate elite, the Johns Hopkins University Center for Health Security, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, together with the big pharma companies, they carried out an exercise. And the exercise was a large-scale simulation of what they would recommend should there be a pandemic. this was September 2019. And the quote, one of the quotes of this exercise said, governments, international organizations, and businesses should plan for how essential corporate capabilities will be used during a large-scale pandemic. Governments should partner with private media corporations to develop the ability to flood media with fast, accurate, and consistent information. Trusted, influential private sector employers should create capacity to readily and reliably augment public messaging, manage rumors and misinformation, and amplify credible information to support emergency public communications. Media companies should commit to ensuring that authoritative messages are prioritized and that false messages are suppressed, including through the use of technology. So the bottom line here is they had been preparing 10 years with strategies. How do we increase vaccine sales and markets around the world? The global health emergency hits. They didn't deliberately plan it, but it facilitates then a massive transfer of wealth to the rich. The heightening of power of the transnational capitalist class allows the imposition of these states of emergency and control and sets the basis for a new global vaccine regime anytime there's anything going on medically. And this is why we have the estimates that the global vaccine, by the way, the global vaccine market, I mentioned, Pfizer made almost $100 billion in profits in 2021, compared to the entire global vaccine market before the pandemic was only 40 billion. So just one company made twice the global vaccine market value during the pandemic. So, you know, this is some of the situation that we're facing in this new era.
And this issue of the control of CDC, World Health Organization, by the pharmaceutical companies, big pharma, does that mean that, in fact, they don't want the pandemic to end because it's a revenue stream for their profits? In other words, they have an incentive to continue to have epidemics because they make money from it, and it's a permanent revenue stream.
Well, yes, that they have an incentive to have endless pandemics and endless new viruses for which you can create vaccines and have a permanent revenue stream. You are absolutely right about that. But on the other hand, so it's a little complicated, so I have 2 points to make on that. The first point is that there are other sectors of capital. Right now, I mentioned the hegemonic bloc for me are the big tech companies, military industrial complex, big pharma, and finance. They've come together as the hegemonic bloc. But there are other sectors of global capital that saw their power and their profits decrease because of the pandemic, because the global economy was shut down and because there's now bottlenecks and so forth. So it's a little more complicated. But what I'm suggesting here, and with the quotes that I just made, is that the left is guilty of this too, buying into this official narrative in which now we're going to have one endemic, if it's not a pandemic, it's some endemic, new viruses popping up, or new diseases which can be controlled in other ways, but which the big pharma will come into the scene and develop endless amounts of, just as you said, vaccines and medicines to make an endless stream of profit. But the other thing which worries me so much, this is where I go again, the left has, which I'm repeating, the left has lost sight of this, that if we're imposing a new regime in which the public has now sees as normal that you have vaccine passports. I just read an article, I don't have it in front of me because literally came out yesterday, in which the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, together with the big pharma corporations, this foundation is not looking for the good of the planet's people. It's working with big pharma and with big finance and with big tech. It is big tech. Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. But now they are private initiative calling for a general vaccine mandatory policies and a vaccine passport. So next year there'll be a new virus. And next year, everyone in order to get into a museum or go to school will have to get a shot for that. And it will be mandatory and it will be digital. So there's also an end to our medical privacy. I mean, this was a real health emergency. There's no doubt about that. But the response is one which intensifying control and profit making from above. And a lot of us have bought into it because we're fear of getting sick and our fear has been manipulated.
And the other aspect of the crisis that I believe you write about in the book is the financial crisis and the banks. And right now, the mayor of New York was on TV today talking about cryptocurrency. He wants to make New York the center of cryptocurrency. In El Salvador, it was made the national currency. First of all, cryptocurrency, is this a real value? Is this a real way of taking value because of the fluctuations in the currency? And isn't this a reflection of capitalism, that they don't have an understanding of value, and they're speculating on cryptocurrency is an example of the contradictions in capitalism and the capitalists themselves of not knowing what the value of their currency is?
Yes. So let me address two things. There's cryptocurrency and then there's digital currency, and they're related. They're related. So before I speak to cryptocurrency, and you're right basically in what you're saying, let me say something about digital currency. The powers that be and the financial industry is going digital, and they want to introduce digital currency rather than paper money or the traditional ways that we do our finance. Now, under a totally different system, that could be very efficient and very useful, but it's going to be used for ever tighter social control. Let's look at what happened in Ontario. And I'm not going to speak if that was good or bad, the truckers. That's not the point. It's not a political discussion. The point that I want to have, the point is that the Canadian government responded by freezing their personal bank accounts. And so that's extremely dangerous, because now we could have a leftist protest against a war, a US war, and they're can call us terrorists or dissidents, and they can freeze our bank accounts. But it's hard for them to do that. But when it's digital currency, simply through computers, all of our transactions, our own money can be so tightly controlled. And so this is very dangerous, the move towards a digital currency, which can be easily controlled by states. They can shut us off. We have dissidents, and we disagree with something. So our digital bank accounts are so easily controlled. The Department of Homeland Security, about a week ago, worried that there was going to be new truck caravans in the United States, said that they would henceforth consider any mis or disinformation about the pandemic to be terrorism, and therefore evoke anti-terrorist laws. So the issue of this heightened, control over finance globally is very dangerous. But let's talk to cryptocurrency. You are absolutely right that the phenomenal, this incredible rise in the value of digital currencies is nothing but financial speculation. And so I been talking about the global crisis, and I've mentioned it's both structural or economic, but it's also political, it's also ecological, it's also social. But at the structural level, it's what we call a crisis of overaccumulation, meaning that so many wages are so low that people can't buy everything that the global economy turns out. As machinery and technology replaces human labor, less and less people are in the stable labor force. And so you have a situation where transnational corporations have accumulated so much trillions of dollars in profits, but they don't find where they can profitably invest that money. So they invest that money in financial speculation. And part of this financial speculation, and I think the last time you interviewed me, I gave this figure that the whole global economy is valued at $75 trillion a year, whereas speculation just in derivatives, which is a speculative instrument, is $1 quadrillion. $1 quadrillion. So there's this massive speculation that doesn't correspond to the real economy that we all depend on. So the cryptocurrency story is the same thing. It's massive speculation where capitalists don't have anywhere else to park their money and try and speculate with it because of chronic stagnation, because of overaccumulation. And so, that's what's going on with cryptocurrencies. It's a false solution for countries that adopt it, such as El Salvador. And it really simply reflects this unfathomable financial speculation, which has nothing to do with the real economy, and which can collapse at any moment. We will have another financial collapse like 2008. It'll come differently under different circumstances. It's inevitable.
And the solution to the pandemic immediately, if they hadn't put money into the economy, would have been the collapse of the world economy. That's what they were afraid of. And that's why they decided that they were going to provide some funding for working people, but a large amount of funding went to the banks went to hedge funds. I mean, have you ever heard of a time where the US government or any government is going to give money to hedge funds to keep them solvent?
Well, we've seen that. We've seen that. So let's talk about those bailouts because that's very important. But the first big bailouts, which was the dry one for the pandemic, was in 2008. And so now we have figures. We have, after 12 years, 13 years later, we have these figures that the initial bailout by the United States was $17 trillion for the 2008 crisis and its aftermath. $17 trillion to the banks. And from the banks, they merely recirculated that into new rounds of speculation in the global economy. But now, and I think I probably forgot to mention this earlier in the interview, $8 trillion in bailouts was given by the United States government and the European Union governments to the banks and the corporations in the first 6 months of the pandemic. $8 trillion. So they literally, as you just said, gave a gift to the banks and the corporations so that the global economy wouldn't completely collapse. And in some countries, there were very modest relief, but you have to, and most countries, in fact, the United Nations reported that 2.7 billion people got no government relief whatsoever. They're forced into lockdown, no government relief. We have to remember that 2 billion people in the global economy work in the informal sector. So they get no relief. They're not even officially employed. And then another 1.5 billion people in the global economy work under precarious conditions, very unstable conditions, like Uber drivers that didn't get any relief. So yes, we had the pandemic involved a massive bailout, which was a transfer of wealth to the banks, to more speculation, and basically a gift, just as you said, our tax money going to give hedge funds free money. And small amounts of relief for hundreds of millions of people that lost their job and that couldn't survive.
When we talk about the ramifications, political ramifications of this, there is no mass working class party in the United States. In most countries, you have social democratic parties that want to reform capitalism, as the Kut and others. The issue of a civil war, we know that there's growing class divide. The right wing say that we want freedom. We have to have freedom, but what kind of freedom are they talking about? What do you think is the solution politically for the working class in the context of what you've portrayed in your book of capitalism gone wild and using technology, robotics to replace workers, automating and marginalizing the working class as much as possible for more profits, even deepening their crisis?
Yes. Well, I want to go back to, you're completely right. There is no significant organized left in the United States. There are no leftists, much less revolutionary parties that can give leadership to mass discontent in the United States in the face of this crisis of legitimacy and in the face of a situation in which the vast majority of people in the United States are downwardly mobile. They're experiencing rising socioeconomic destabilization and mass social insecurity. So if you don't have a left organizing them and giving them an alternative interpretation of the crisis, one which says the problem of this crisis is the power of capital, then the far right can mobilize them. And that's exactly what is happening. So if I may, I want to go back to that chapter I have on Wither the Global Revolt. And I identified, as I mentioned to you already, this incredible upsurge in resistance around the world. But there are 4 challenges. And one of those challenges I already mentioned is that you have all these social movements with no left leadership. And that paves the way for the far right to gain traction among these groups. But there's other challenges. And I used, the Black Lives Matter uprising after the George Floyd murder as the case study. So that went nowhere in the United States, despite 30 million people taking to the streets, because there was no left presence to say, okay, we're protesting this murder and police violence, but now we have to challenge the system itself. But there are other serious problems here. And one of the problems, and I know this is going to be controversial to some of your listeners and viewers on this podcast and on the radio interview, is that we have what I call an identitarian paradigm. This identitarian paradigm is hegemonic. And it's not it's a paradigm which has eclipsed the language of class struggle, the language of a critique of capitalism, the language of political economy, so we understand what the capitalist system is doing to us. So under these circumstances, again, to use the Black Lives Matter example, the protest fizzled out because what were they arguing? Defund the police without seeing the police as just the front line of the capitalist state and the defense by the capitalist state of the rich and of the property classes, then called for the statues to come down. I was happy to see those statues come down, but that doesn't change one bit the power structure, one bit, or it doesn't resolve one bit the crisis. And then they were demanding that military bases named after, fascist generals be changed. So you can change a military base to Martin Luther King Jr. military base, one that's an insult to Martin Luther King Jr., but it changes nothing about the nature of the US military as an imperial instrument against the world's people. So the point is we don't have this leftist discourse, and we do have an identitarian discourse. So I'll conclude with this because you're talking about how fascism mobilizes in the United States and is gaining traction. So the leadership of the fascist movement are actually sectors of capital and sectors of the political elite. Trump, is a fascist. He's mobilizing a fascist base, and he's a multi-billionaire. But there is a mass base to fascism, which is a working class base, disproportionately white and susceptible to racist, to manipulation by a racist message. So what is our job as leftists? We have to give that the white members of the working class who are susceptible to be mobilized by fascism, we have to give them a leftist message. We have to say, we understand that you are suffering. You're experiencing under and unemployment. You experience socioeconomic insecurity. You don't have health insurance. You're losing your job. Okay, all we have to say, and this is our leftist message to you. But the identitarian paradigm doesn't say that to these white members of the working class who are being mobilized by fascism. It says, you have white privilege. You're not what we're about. You're racists. You're useless. And so we have problems on the left, which is contributing to fascism gaining traction. And we have to acknowledge that.
Well, isn't that the question of a working class party? Because a working class party would actually have a class, it would fight racial, sexual discrimination, homophobia, Islamophobia, would also have a class program for the entire working class to unite the working class. Isn't that the pressing issue, that there is no working class political alternative to the capitalist parties, which both actually have the same economic program of protection of capital in the United States and internationally? Right.
I agree with you 100%. And that's why I started. The biggest problem here, you have all of this desire for radical change, right? And yet you don't have working class parties, you don't have leftist parties that are powerful enough to lead that and to counter the right-wing mobilization, to give a critique of capital that masses of people can hear and can assimilate and understand. But I want to add something to it, and this is where I know it is polemical among people that are listening, our comrades among the left, but we have to also critique what sectors of the left, or they call themselves left, the message they're putting out, which once again, that's the identitarian paradigm. You have this situation where the left, including the Black liberation movement, the Chicano liberation movement, in the 1960s and 70s was clear in identifying capitalism as the enemy. The Black Panther Party, there's all this new nostalgia among young people, and that's good for the Black Panther Party and for those radical struggles of the 60s and 70s. But the fact is the Black Panther Party was a socialist organization, an organization that critiqued capitalism and said we have to overthrow capitalism, and an organization that, although they only had Black members, said we want to align with, with what Fred Hampton called for, a rainbow coalition of all different groups, right? But so what do we have today? We have this, especially in universities, we have a identitarian paradigm which doesn't want to hear about a critique of capitalism, which doesn't want to hear about the instrument of Marxism to understand political economy and understand capital, which doesn't have the language of class. It just has the language of specific identities. So the problem isn't a struggle against racism. We need that to be front and center. The problem isn't that we have these identities, but that the problem is that a sector of the left, or intellectual left in the universities, reject class and a critique of capitalism. So that fuels what we've already identified. The lack of a radical left, socialist and socialist-oriented left, that could give a message to the mass of working people that are rejecting, their miserable situation.
Okay, well, I want to thank you very much. We've been talking with William Robinson. He is the author of Global Civil War, Capitalism Post-Pandemic, and also he's been looking at the effect of capitalism in the COVID pandemic and the danger to the working class in the United States and the world globally. So I think this is an important issue. And first of all, understanding it and then having a plan and program to challenge it. So thanks for joining us on Work Week.
Thank you so much for having me on.